Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum, namaste, Sastrikal. My name is Farheen Khan and you're watching the Azeeza show. This week we're actually going to talk about the issue of climate change. As we have started to see more of a rise in conservative governments, a lot of times the discussions keep happening about, cutting the carbon tax and not worrying about the climate. And then we've got, other groups saying, well, no, climate change is actually real and we need to talk about it. So today in studio we have Carlee and Darcy with us. So thank you so much for being on the show.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
No worries. So I want to just jump right into it. Maybe you guys can start with introducing yourselves and then we'll start the conversation.
Go ahead.
My name's Carlee Hansen. I'm the Director of Operations with Studio 89. We're a nonprofit community hub and fair trade cafe. We offer accessible programming for the community as well as youth leadership opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
I'm Darcy Higgins, and I run a social venture called Buildingroots with my partner Lisa Cates, and in Toronto, and we build socially cohesive communities. And I have a background in food justice issues and environmental advocacy for a few years.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for being here and for having this really important conversation. So, can we talk a little bit about what does climate change mean to you? Mm-hmm. Feel free to.
Climate change is a term that was coined a few decades ago. For me, it just means a gradual change in the Earth's atmosphere, as well as changing global landscape. So what that means for us is increased precipitation, decreasing glaciers, melting glaciers, increasing sea levels, depletion of species.
Yeah, we used to say global warming, which is not used as much anymore. That's because the Earth is warming totally, but the climate is changing in different ways in different places. Right. So it can actually cool in one area for a while. So climate change has different kinds of impacts, and those impacts are coming very quickly. And the climate has changed already because of fossil fuels use of the last 150 years, and so there's a lot more coming.
So how do you feel, I guess we should start with, so I appreciate that you've kind of laid it out for us. So why is there such a concern? I know I'm concerned about it myself as well, but if we could tell the audience, what is the big concern about climate change? Why should we care?
I think the concern comes in, some portion of climate change is natural. It's a natural process. You've heard of the Ice Age and different periods of the Earth's development, but I think the concern comes in when human advancement has really expedited the process of climate change.
Right.
We're looking at studies showing that within the next century, 50% of species on Earth will be depleted. A new study shows that even with if we meet the Paris Climate Agreement goals, we'll still lose 25% of our species within the next century. I think that's a huge cause for concern.
For sure.
Yeah, and then our human systems interrelate and depend on natural systems across the world. So when species are affected, like pollinators, bees that support our food system,
right.
or the ways that agriculture and disease can be spread in a heated planet. Agriculture is affected, water systems are affected. We can talk more about that, but
right.
the whole, when it comes down to it, the amount of warming that could happen over the next century is actually incompatible with human life. Like, humans have not actually been around when the temperature of the planet has been
right.
at the temperature it is. So we're basically having a big gamble here with our existence, as well as the depletion of the rest of the species.
For sure.
And I think in terms of climate change, we always think of it affecting our children and our grandchildren, but these changes are happening so quickly that it's going to affect our current generation. And I think just the cause for concern is so high, and it's a little alarming seeing people who deny it.
Yeah, exactly, right? And I think in some ways we're already seeing it ourselves, right? We're seeing the way in which, even something as basic as the weather, right? And how much it's fluctuating even within the springtime. We're seeing snow come, we're seeing less of a winter sometimes, but then, you're seeing snow in April, right? Or possibly even May, and just the sort of strangeness of how things are moving.
And those are things we're seeing here, but with climate change and global warming, there's also increased extreme weather phenomenon, such as like hurricanes, tsunamis, and other natural disasters that are really impacting parts of the world.
As well, absolutely. We keep
Forest
hearing about it.
fires.
Yeah.
Yes.
If you think of the massive fires in Alberta, in the west coast of the US, and then other countries, Australia and other places in the world, the fires are extraordinary and getting worse, and scientists have attributed the increase of those to climate change.
Right. And so how does it make you feel when, politicians are like, well, the carbon tax doesn't matter and, who cares about the climate? Like, what does that...
It just makes me exasperated because there's so much scientific data backing up climate change and backing up the fact that these changes are taking place and that they're so accelerated by human intervention. So it just makes me very frustrated and very worried about the future.
Yeah, I mean, a few years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, when people were learning more about it, there might have been an excuse, although it was really a push of propaganda and money behind it by particular corporate interests. But you hear about it today and still climate change denial or the denial of action, and it's infuriating. It's a crime that this is happening, and it's because of the impacts that our generation in the future will suffer. Yeah, it's extraordinary to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I especially just when you look at Alberta now, right, and even sort of what we're hearing about in terms of the new government coming in under Jason Kenney, and just the idea of again going back to more pipelines and cut the carbon tax and stuff like that. Do you think it's intentional that they're just not thinking about it, that it's all about sort of corporate profit, it doesn't really matter, or is there I just don't understand why they would spend millions of dollars on trying to challenge environmental groups and try to cut down sort of progressive thought around that.
I think politics comes down to profits in a way, so that the corporate interests that are involved in the political changes are a lot more effective than the public outcry that we have regarding climate change right now. So I think if we can find a way to make public outcry and public frustration higher than what politicians are receiving from as far as what's going to fund the next election, I think that's when we'll see real change.
And it's also a wedge. It's a way to wedge the public on side for conservative politicians, that they can allow misinformation to come to the public. People affected by the price of gas, issues that are very particular to them or their small business, and they believe what politicians and other propaganda is telling them. And so I guess that's used in some places to prop up this ideology, and show just they're going to fight environmentalists in Alberta. They're going to sue them. They're going to investigate and just make a big issue out of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, we're going to take a quick break and then we'll be back. Okay, we'll be back right after this. Hi everyone, welcome back. We were just talking about climate change before the break. So, Carlee and Darcy, we were just talking sort of about before the break, some of the challenges and sort of why perhaps corporate groups are really investing in this type of or they're making such an effort to kind of shut down and silence environmentalists, right? And ultimately, I think you're right. It's a lot. It has a lot to do with profit, right? And finding, sort of those little wedge issues that will make or break the elections essentially, and bring them on side, which is really unfortunate. But so, can we talk a little about carbon tax? Like, what is it, and why is that important?
Sure. Yeah, I've supported a carbon tax for many years, and it's nice to see it's actually in place federally. The protest against it by certain provinces is really strong.
Right.
Basically, you want to put a price on fossil fuels, and that's an idea that you want to to tax bad things, not good things.
For sure.
So increase the cost of that. People are going to use it less, and you want to have companies pay for that. You were talking about that.
Yes, I was. So as far as the carbon tax, I think the idea that it's levied on individuals is something that could be reworked, where we can levy it on the industries that are creating the greenhouse emissions, the carbon dioxide, the gases, everything that's impacting climate change. I think it's just a better way to go about it. As an individual, the cost of gas going up isn't going to change the fact that I need a car. It's not going to change the fact that I need to heat my home.
Yeah.
But if we levy those funds on the corporate interests that are lobbying for them, I think it'll put more of a drive towards sustainable alternatives.
That's a great idea.
In order for them to maintain their profits.
The idea that polluters should pay.
For sure, and they should.
Yeah, and that's what was happening under the provincial system in Ontario. The Liberals came up with a cap and trade system, and then the funds that were raised from that, when fees were levied on carbon use, the funds were going back to environmental programs. The federal system is that carbon it's not really taxed, it's a fee, and then there's a financial reward back to citizens. So I just did my tax return yesterday. I'm getting money back, and if you look at the money that's for the individual, the average person, how much gas and energy they're using, you're probably getting a little bit more money back than you're spending on gas. So those that say otherwise is not really true.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So what can everyday people do about climate change, and how can they make a difference?
I think there's three main ways that you can make a difference starting tomorrow. The first one a lot of people don't think of is reducing your meat consumption.
Okay.
There's a big movement of going vegan and things like that now, but it doesn't have to be that drastic. I think just cutting back the amount of meat you're consuming can make a huge difference.
And how does that work? Can you explain that a little
Well, with
more?
cattle production, there's a lot of methane emissions that come from the cattle, just from their living, breathing daily lives, as well as nitrous for the fertilizer. It takes a lot more grain to feed a cattle than it does to feed a respective number of humans.
Right.
So that's one way you can reduce your carbon emissions and your impact on the climate.
Sure.
The second way I can think of is take more consideration with the clothing that you're purchasing.
Okay.
A lot of people don't realize that the fashion industry is a huge global polluter. In countries like China and India, there's a lot of different emissions made from the factories that make the clothing, as well as the dyes and materials are causing acidification of the oceans,
Right.
which leads to coral reefs dying. It leads to a lot of species in the ocean that we're losing.
For sure.
And I think the third thing we can do in our daily lives is just being an advocate for combating climate change. I think we have to make it sexy.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is a lot of people are more concerned with what the Kardashians are doing than reports that are coming out, like the new climate changing report in Canada. So I think being an advocate for global sustainability, and by that I mean you can share the blog post of the new plant-based recipe you found. You can brag about the dress you found from a secondhand store.
Right.
There's a lot of small things that we can do in our daily lives just to make global sustainability more of a priority.
For sure.
I don't know those people because I don't follow the Kardashians. I love reading climate reports, but that's just me. So I think you're right, and definitely those points are right on, especially animal production. Most people don't know that they say, well, you're gonna grow soy or vegetables, and those take a lot of land, right? But most of the land grown where crops are grown, a lot of that is going for meat production. So we need to do as much as we can about eating closer to a vegan diet. You don't have to go crazy right away. But the point about advocating, and so young people are standing up, led by
We've been seeing some of the
this
groups
young
come out,
woman,
right?
Greta, in Europe, leading a global movement, spending Friday, she's on leading a school strike, and not going back to school until, and this is a really strong movement and language that she's using. So young people can actually spend their time taking a Friday off school and going to protest, which was done at Queen's Park recently. And we just have to push that forward so much.
Right.
was discussed about the Paris Climate Agreement, even that is not going to meet where we need to go.
Right.
So we just have to ramp up the activism as much as possible, get the message out, and spend as much time on that. And then what I'm also really interested in, because climate change is happening now regardless, it's started to happen, and there's a lag, so the amount of emissions used a few decades ago, that influences how the climate's heating up now.
Right.
So they've continued to go, so the amount now is going to affect us in a few decades. So even if we turn the oil off now, it's going to still have a lag. So climate change is real, it's going to happen, and we really need to also think about adaptation at our communities, how to make our neighborhoods more resilient, and how
Right.
to get together with our neighbors to think about those things.
And how would they do that?
Well, I've been trying to think of that in my work. We're building social cohesion at the community level.
Right.
And then the idea of resilience means that we need to think about being prepared, prepared for flooding, prepared for food shortages, what might happen in your community. So I think groups getting together and talking about the issues, looking at what might happen. There's been some work in Brampton on that, in
Right.
downtown Toronto. But I think really we need those social connections with our neighbors because when something happens, we need to depend on those networks.
Absolutely.
I think it's important what you're saying about planning resilience, because regardless of what we're being told by politicians and other entities, climate change is happening.
Right.
And as you were saying, Darcy, just the impact from today, like if we cut off all our greenhouse emissions tomorrow, we'd still be experiencing these changes.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Hopefully we can continue this conversation, but for those watching, definitely think about climate change. It's definitely real, and it's already happening. So do your part, and let's try to make a difference together. Until next week, take care.